Morning. Welcome to the November 2015 meeting of the History Group, or the Winter History Forum, as we're calling it, in honor of the season that doesn't feel like it today, but will soon be upon us. And we're happy to have you here. Today's program is Richard Gifford, who has spoken a couple times for us now. He's a genealogist, a lawyer, and genealogist who,
more fun being a genealogist.
I bet it's a lot more fun, who has found some just amazing connections to connecting people, for example, from Westport to British royalty and so forth. And today he's going to talk about the White family from the Cadman White Handy House, and connections to other families or buildings in Westport and Dartmouth and Tiverton and Little Compton. And that'll be on in a few minutes. And after that, I'm going to open up a discussion of, since we're starting the year, and we now have, excuse me, a slightly different involvement with the Historical Society in this program, we want to find out what people want to do. What are the kind of things the topics that you'd like, the speakers that you'd like, maybe some volunteers among you to do a brief program. And these can be 10-minute programs. They don't have to be PowerPoint or anything like that. They could just be discussions, things that you want to talk about, anecdotes, things you remember, or things you might have done some research on. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. I wanted to start, though, with to talk just a little bit about one of our members who died this year, Norma Judson. And I'm sure you all know that. And Norma was not just a member of this group, she started the group. About 10 years ago, she would invite people very graciously into her living room and feed them and open up discussions on Westport history. And she got this started, and she got to a point where she couldn't host the meetings anymore, and so we moved them down here. But she was just a tremendous local historian, did an awful lot for Westport history. I still remember the first meeting I went to at her house about 8 years ago, and she gave a quiz, which is what she was famous for, her 20-question quizzes. And as I recollect, I got 17 wrong. And I'm not sure that I'd do that much better now. She had these wonderful quizzes, but all in fun, and we learned a lot and had a very good time. I also think of Norma every time I walk into the library. If you haven't been in the history room at the library, you should really go. The local history room is terrific. It's a very comfortable place to do research, and there's a lot of stuff there, and it's all organized by Norma. She just did a marvelous job. And if anybody wants to help me in my quest to have that room named for Norma, please let me know, because I think it would be a very fitting tribute to the work that Norma did at the library and in the town in general. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Richard Gifford.
Okay. What I've done is really to show a kind of a collection of houses that were built by descendants of William White and Elizabeth Cadman. I decided to do it as houses. First, of course, I had to work out who their descendants were, in a sense, do a genealogy. But I thought to try something different, instead of just showing a kind of list of names and dates, by putting it in terms of the houses they lived in, you'll have something you can actually see, and places which we drive by and see all the time. And perhaps by knowing, at least this happened to me, by knowing who lived in these houses a long time ago, you gain a different and deeper appreciation of those houses around us. Now you might say, well, why pick on the Whites? Why not pick some other family? I guess there's a couple of reasons. First of all, of course, by virtue of the Historical Society owning the Handy House, the Whites are almost the first family of this Historical Society. And of course, William White's grandfather, Peregrine White, was born on the Mayflower as it was anchored off Provincetown, and was the first white or first English child born in New England. So in a sense, the Whites are also the first family of New England. Peregrine White's father, who was also named William White, died the first winter, as about half the passengers did who landed at Plymouth. And the following spring, his mother, Susanna, married Edward Winslow, who became governor of Plymouth Colony. But that was the first marriage that was performed in New England. And so Peregrine White, who was William White's grandfather, was he was both the stepson of a governor of Plymouth Colony, the half-brother of Josiah Winslow, who was governor of Plymouth Colony during King Philip's War. He was the first child born in New England, first English child born in New England. And his mother was also the first woman to be married in New England. So quite a few distinctions that merit, I think, some attention to the White family. I haven't organized it in any particular way. They're not really organized chronologically or by generation. So I'll just start going through them, and like I say, some of them you probably will recognize. This house is a circa 1850 Greek Revival. This is on Hicksbridge Road, right near the entrance to the winery. This was built by Leonard Gifford, whose wife Anne White was a great granddaughter of William White. The site of this house, if you look at the stone walls and from some evidence in the deeds, is probably the site where Samuel Cornell built his house way back in 1680s probably, who owned all of the vineyard property, what we would think of as the vineyard property. And eventually, as we'll see, that property comes to be inherited by Anne White Gifford's father. Let me see if I can. Oh. Am I hitting the right one? It's not moving.
Uh-oh.
Oh, here it is, because I had to tap the, I just had to tap the screen to get it off the screensaver.
Okay.
Oh, you've gone backward. No, you're going backward. I want to go forward.
Oh, you want to go forward?
Yes, I want to go forward. There it is. This house is across the road from the house we just seen. I think this was built by her father, William White. This is about a 1840, again, Greek Revival. Later it was lived in by Philip Sanford, who was the son-in-law of Leonard and Anne White Gifford. But I think this house was probably built by William White, but we'll see the house that is attributed to William White is this house, which, as you can see from a side view, is a very small house. William White was a hatter, and if on the plaque the house was built in 1760 by William White. It's very doubtful that he built this house. For one thing, he was born in 1773. For another thing, he had 11 children. And for yet another, he was a fairly prominent man. He was a town clerk of Westport. And if you look back through the old records, in 1807 and 1808, the town meeting, Westport town meeting, was held at his house. So I don't think they held it here. I think he probably lived in the house we just saw. And before that, probably in the old Cornell house that would have been on the site of the first house we looked at. His wife, Cynthia Cornell, was the sole heir of Abraham Cornell, who owned what we would think of as the vineyard property, which extended at the time north of Hicksbridge Road. And I think he probably used, William White, I suspect, used this as a hat shop because he was a hatter by trade. He also owned property, not only the vineyard property, he owned the property up near the head. He owned it where the stone house is and where that whole row of houses, including where the Bell School is, kind of L-shaped property, which was about 20 acres, which he sold to John Avery Parker in the 1790s. He also owned the area where the boat launch area is on the east side of Hicks Bridge. Well, he was called, if you see him on early records, he's called William White II. And what they did by designating someone in the second back in those days, it didn't mean a relationship necessarily. It meant that they would be the younger of two men of the same name in the community. In this case, William White I would have been his uncle, William White, who lived out on Shalati White Road. This is a house occupied by Samuel Gifford, who was the son of the people who lived in the first house we looked at. He was a White descendant himself, of course, through his mother. He also married a White, Eliza White, who was the daughter of John White, whose house we'll see a little bit later. Whoop.
Where is that?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's, gotta go back here. That's on Hicks Bridge Road. It's east of the intersection of Pine Hill and Horseneck, on the north side of the road. Now, here's the first house in Little Compton. This is at Little Compton Commons, number 2 Commons. I should explain a bit about the descendants of William White. I forget, I think they had 10 children or something like that in all. But there were really only 4 children who lived in this area who left descendants. 2 of them lived in Westport, the sons, William Jr. and George White. And then 2 of them lived in Little Compton, Christopher White and Hannah White, who married John Brown. This house was built by a man, Abraham Wilbur, whose wife was a great-great-granddaughter of William White. This is about an 1840 house. I didn't take a picture of the rear L of this house. It's kind of interesting. It was about in 1820. It was the original Methodist church in Little Compton, the first of 3 Methodist churches that existed in Little Compton. Oh, this house was also occupied by a guy, their son, named William Brown Wilbur. And like a lot of people in that area, he was a 49er. And he went out to California, and after he came back, he was in the habit of getting drunk, I guess somewhere down Meeting House Lane. So he was coming home one night and yelling at the top of his lungs. He was saying, "Pikes Peak or bust," which was a slogan of the old 49ers. So one of the neighbors went out to kind of quiet him down and get him home, and was helping him, and he stumbled and fell, and he refused to get up. He says, "I'm not getting," he says, "I've reached Pikes Peak, and I'm not going any further." And thereafter, in a kind of mocking tribute to this guy, the area where he fell, which is that triangle of land that is just to the west of the Old Common Cemetery, where they hold the Memorial Day exercises, was called Pikes Peak, and it's still called that today. So sometimes things you do in Little Compton are very hard to live down. Other evidence of how slowly things change in Little Compton. This is Wilbur's store. Still with the estate of C.R. Wilbur. Charles Richmond Wilbur died in 1914, over 100 years ago. It's still called by the name of his estate. In the mid to late 1800s, this store was operated by Preston Baker Richmond, who was a William White descendant. We'll see his father's house in a minute. And he was also a 49er, Preston Baker Richmond. And in the Civil War, he was a member of the 7th Rhode Island Infantry and participated at the Battle of Fredericksburg and the assault on Marie's Heights. And on the night after the battle, he and 3 of his comrades infiltrated past the Confederate lines to retrieve the body of their commander who had fallen in battle. And who also, the commander received the Congressional Medal of Honor as a result of that. charge. This is where Preston Baker Richmond lived. This house, I think, probably was built by Pardon Brownell. It's probably about circa 1800 or so, very much altered over the years. Modern people remember this as Ida Smith's house. Ida Smith, who I remember, when I worked at Wilbur Store in the 1970s briefly, I remember as a very old lady, and she was the youngest daughter of C.R. Wilbur, who the store is named for. This house was another Abraham Wilbur house. This house about circa 1800. It was moved from the corner where we saw that first house in order to put that house there. And then this house was moved to the south. This house was built by Corinne Richmond Burchard. The Richmond family, who were all the modern Richmonds are all white descendants. They had a lot of money. Sometimes it seemed like they had more money than they knew what to do with. But this house was built actually in the 1930s. The second story on the left is actually a 1700s cape that used to be at that location that they incorporated and built this rather massive Georgian revival around it. But they used this as a summer house. This is, oh, I'm sorry. This is south of Commons Road, Little Compton. It's about maybe a quarter of a mile south of the intersection on the west side of the road. These next few houses are all in that same area.
Chimney. What, would that have been part of the old house?
I don't know. That looks like a modern chimney from where I'm looking. But that's probably about where the old house would have begun. Yes. Another Richmond summer house. This house is called Seaborn Mary, and it was built in Londonderry, New Hampshire, about 1730. And one of the Richmonds back in the 1930s saw it there, and he said, "I want that as a summer house." And so the owner said, "Okay, I'll sell it to you." He said, but I want it in Little Compton. So they, I don't know if they dismantled it or just picked it up whole and loaded it on a barge, but they moved it down to Little Compton. It's sat ever since. Like I said, the Richmonds sometimes had did weird things with their money. This is the Isaac Bailey Richmond farm. Unfortunately, with the foliage, I couldn't get a good picture of this. His wife was the White descendant. His wife was a great-great-granddaughter of William White. She was a Brown. Her surname was Brown. And Isaac Bailey Richmond built this about 1830. He had been an architect. He had worked mainly in Savannah, Georgia, and then came back in the 1840s. He was involved in the whaling industry in New Bedford and a lot of importing type business. When he was in Savannah, he owned a number of slaves, which supposedly he freed upon his returning to Little Compton, but several he brought north with him as servants. This is it's next to the first house we were looking at. This is directly across from the Congregational Church, used as the parsonage. This was built by Walter Wilbur. His wife was a Brown, another White descendant, William White descendant. Remarkably similar in the detailing of this house to a house we'll see later on, with a kind of double bracketing at the cornice and the window caps as well. It's kind of almost Italianate features. This house is similar, built about between 1840 and 1850. Back to Westport. The corner of Reed and Old County Road. This is the house built by John Lowray Anthony, whose wife was Mary White Kirby, who was a white descendant, probably built about 1870. There's something not quite right about this house as a Second Empire. It really lacks the kind of mansard roof that would be characteristic for those houses, but part of that may be because supposedly they built this around a pre-existing 1720 house at that location, which was probably, I suspect, the 1720 house would have been built by Jeremiah Gifford. This property is the far southwest corner of a 278-acre parcel that was sold in the 1740s by Jeremiah Gifford's heirs to William Reed. John L. Anthony, who lived here, he was a storekeeper. I think it was the store that later became Shorrock's at the head that he operated for many years. For some reason, a lot of the white descendants were storekeepers. I don't know why. This is over at the corner of Gifford Road and Old County. This house was built by Jonathan Peckham about 1803. Jonathan Peckham's wife was, let me see, Hannah White Soule. She was a White. She was actually the sister of William White, whose house we saw down on Hicksbridge Road. Her first husband, David Soule, was captured by the British in 1779 off the Virginia Capes and never heard from again. So this was her second marriage. They were the parents of Peleg White Peckham, and who was a very well-known and wealthy figure at the head of Westport. He organized the Linden Grove Cemetery, really started. And then Jonathan Peckham's son-in-law, Abner B. Gifford, was the one who donated the land for the Bell School in the 1840s. Oh, I'm going to do one more. So the stone house at the head has a few more than one white connection, actually. Supposedly built by Stephen Howland in 1832. His wife was Amy White. She was a great-great-granddaughter of William White. I have some doubts about whether he was the one who built it or not, but certainly in any case, a very noteworthy house. I'm not sure. It's almost, it seems to me almost Egyptian in a way, in some of its styling on the second story. But in any event, it definitely has a white connection because it was also purchased in the 1860s by Stephen P. Kirby, whose mother and paternal grandmother were both whites. And then the Kirbys continued, his descendants continued to live here for many years after that, about 100 years, I think. And I think the prior picture was the, I guess that's, I don't know, a tea house or something like that. So, oh, that's new. Oh, okay.
Couple years.
Oh, I never noticed it before. Yeah, okay. This much more modest house across the road from the stone house, that's John Gifford, whose wife, Mary Kirby, was a white descendant. This is another kind of typical 1848, I think this one is, Greek Revival. Further south on Drift Road, this is Holder White Jr., who's a great-great-grandson of William White. Another Greek Revival. It's 1842. Holder White Jr., he had a shop, a carpentry shop, where he built up at the landing, and he built carriages and coffins, so he could provide his customers with a smooth and comfortable ride, whether in this lifetime or the next. And I think this continued to be occupied by descendants of Holder White until, maybe even until now, but at least until recent times. Yeah, it's not a very good picture. This is further south on Drift Road. I'll try the next picture. I think I have two pictures. This is 463 Drift. This house was built about 1770. It's attributed in the inventory to George White, but George White had died by that time. I think this house was built by his son, Obed White, who was a grandson of William White. It's situated on a property that was called the Obed White Farm. Across the road from this at 450 Drift, that is, I think, the location of the where George Cadman would have lived, and what George White, who was the father of Obed White, ultimately inherited. And I think the cemetery where the earliest generations of Whites and Cadmans were buried is the one called the Obed White Cemetery, which is down by the river. It has about 35 unmarked stones in it. This house, I think, I read in the inventory, was a tea house in, I think, the 1940s or something like that. And at one time, the owner of this house, they had, I don't know, 40 different varieties of trees growing in an orchard behind it or something like that. Pardon me? I don't know. I have no idea. Could be. This is the rear. This is Obed's brother, Sylvanus White. This is down at the intersection of, right across from Shalati White Extension on Drift Road. Built about 1780. Sylvanus White was a grandson of William. It was Sylvanus White. He was the one who gave the 10 acres of land to Zip White, who was ex-slave of his father's and Shalati White's father, on the north side of Shalati White Road, which is where the Shalati White home was located. This is 1263 Drift. This is William Kirby. His mother was a White. He is a great-grandson of William White, or the great-grandson, I should say, of William White. This house was built 1784. Kirby's neighbor to the south was Paul Cuffey, and Paul Cuffey's Allen lot. And they had a dispute that went on for a long time about the stone walls. Cuffey alleged that William Kirby wasn't keeping up his stone walls, so that animals were straying onto Cuffey's property. So he was always writing letters to complain about that, and it wasn't easy to do because at the time there were 14 viewers of fences in Westport. Somehow the United States Supreme Court managed its business with only 9, but they didn't have to deal with wall problems in Westport. Oh, this is another picture of the William Kirby house. Now over to Adamsville. Gray's store, which claimed to be and probably was the oldest continuously operated general store in the United States until, it was anyway, until Grayton Waite died a couple of years ago. The Gray in Gray's store was Philip Gray, who was a descendant of William White. He bought this property about 1860. Let's just closer up. Here you see the south side of Grace. People, you tend to lose sight of the fact, really, the entrance to this building is on the south side. This is the house of, right at the foot of Adamsville Hill, probably built by Joseph Gifford in circa 1800. This was a house of Dr. George F.S. White, who was a son of William White, who owned the vineyard. Dr. White was known for, more so than for doctoring, for making a patent medicine, Dr. White's specialty for diphtheria, which was sold as a mail order product and was very successful. It was so successful that Dr. White died in 1881, and they continued to manufacture it until the 1950s. In the later years, it was actually manufactured by Carlton Brownell and his father. And its longevity, I think, is due to a remarkable characteristic that it had, which it didn't do much for diphtheria, but if you took it and you shook it with some ice and you garnished it with a maraschino cherry, it's a remarkable approximation of a Manhattan, which really helped with sales during Prohibition. And I'm really not exaggerating too much because I've seen the recipe. The recipe is they took 5 gallons of alcohol and 5 gallons of water. Then they had various roots and extracts that they cooked with it. Then you take out the solids, and the last step, they add another 5 gallons of alcohol. But before we think of Dr. White as being kind of a quack or a charlatan, I read somewhere recently that it was someone who was growing up in New Bedford about 1900, who was about 6 years old, had diphtheria. His mother took us to see this very highly regarded doctor who was affiliated with St. Luke's, and the doctor prescribed, says, give your child whiskey. So alcohol was part of the accepted medical repertoire back in those days.
Excuse me,
Yes.
the house you were just showing, would the barn associated with that, would that have been the same era as the house? Torn down.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's where they made the medicine in Dr. White's time. Yeah, I think Win Hart lived here in modern times, if I'm not mistaken. Win Hart had a carpentry shop back there, but when Dr. White owned it, I think that's...
Well, back in the 60s, there was some guy that repaired chairs.
Yeah, it's probably Win Hart. But that was long after Dr. White's time. Dr. White died 1881. This house, just something I noticed about this house, I see this in a lot of houses in Westport. You see the fence, but they have these granite posts. And this, for some reason, it seems to be favored by ship captains. And what they would do is take down this stone wall. See how the stone wall was going along there? Take down the stone wall in front of the house, put in granite posts, but in their era, when they installed it, they had wrought iron railings that have kind of rusted out over the years. Before Dr. White bought this from Sylvester Gifford, and he had the distinction, he was one of only 2 white men who were captains of Cuffey ships, Cuffey family ships, the other being Edward Phillips, who lived on Driftwood. Gray's Gristmill, this was built in 1877 by Philip Gray, who was the same guy who bought Gray's store. Philip Gray had been a miller up in Tiverton. As I said, he was a William White descendant. It was run in modern times by John Hart, whose wife Marion was would have been a white descendant too. When the water power failed for this mill, John Hart, who was kind of a quintessential old Yankee, he found a way to hook up a 1946 Dodge truck engine to power the mill. And that engine lasted, it lasted longer than John did. It lasted up until, I think, very recent times when I think they had to replace it. It's another shot of Gray's grist mill. There had been a mill at the same location going all the way back to probably right about 1700. It's called Tabor's Mills originally. If you see old deeds in Westport for Adamsville Road, it'll say the road from Tabor's Mill to a Coxet Meeting House. And if Cornell Road is the road from Tabor's Mills to Pecacek Point. This is the Wilcox Groves house, as the Longfield house, right on the other side of Adamsville Pond. This was owned by, in the 1800s, by William Augustus Brown, who was great-great-grandson of William White. This is at St. Vincent de Paul Camp. I think there's a better picture of this. This is built in 1832 by George Kirby. George Kirby was himself a White descendant, and he married Patience White, who was a daughter of Sylvanus White, whose house we've seen over on Drift Road. George Kirby is the guy who foreclosed on the Handy House. His sister, Rebecca, was single, and for some reason, there's a story here somewhere, I'm sure, loaned over the years an enormous amount of money, over $3,000, to Dr. Handy. What Dr. Handy used it for, I don't know. How she got it, I don't know. That was a lot of money for anyone to have back in those days. And so George Kirby foreclosed on the Handy House. I don't know if his sister, I don't know if they allowed women to bring lawsuits back in those days. And was she assigned him the debt, or for whatever mechanism, he foreclosed. And when they evaluated the Handy House and its property, I mean, which consisted of probably about 100 acres at the time, it was the value was actually less than the amount of the debt, which shows you how much $3,000 could buy back in the 1860s.
When did you say that was built?
1832? Yeah. This is the Chase Quarry House at Tiverton Four Corners. Is built probably, it wasn't built by a White descendant, it was built by an unknown Chase. They haven't determined which Chase built it, back about 1730. But it was owned around right around the 1790s by Cornelius Seabury, whose wife was a Gray. His wife was a great-granddaughter of William White. And then their son-in-law, Andrew Corey, who was the Corey in Chase Quarry House, lived here for many years after that. This is on Main Road in South Tiverton. This house was built by Peregrine White, who was a grandson of William White. This is a very large for its time farmhouse. Right across the road almost from the herring run into Nonquit Pond on Pond Bridge. So they would have had some a good supply of Swamp Yankee caviar back in the day. That's another shot at the Peregrine White house. And this was built by a great-grandson of that Peregrine White, Andrew Peregrine White, A.P. White. This is a Second Empire store, now the Provender. It was built in 1875. A.P. White conducted a store here for over 50 years, until the 1920s. And yes, yes, He lived, the store was the first floor, and then he lived on the second floor. And I believe he had a couple of people living on the third floor who were like hired hands. At one time, I have a picture of the house. He lived next door to it too, before while he was building this store. A.P. White, David Patton, who was a guy who grew up summers in Little Compton, was editor of the Providence Journal, wrote a lot about Little Compton and about the people in it. But he knew A.P. White, and in one of the stories he writes about A.P. White, he asked them why he was so successful. Other people who set up store in this neighborhood could never stay in business very long. And he said he had two rules that he lived by. One is to get up before dawn every day, and the other one is not to extend credit to bad risk. People, he called them nothing but hog corn and moldy, as he described them. This is yeah, that's right. This is another shot of the A.P. White store. They're standing here is almost like the parking lot of Gray's Ice Cream. Gray's Ice Cream, by the way, so how it came to be called Gray's Ice Cream, and where the parking lot is now was an old Almy house that went back to the 1700s. And in the very early 1900s, there were these two elderly sisters named Gray who sold ice cream out of their parlor window, I guess, and just open it up, and that's how Gray's Ice Cream started, although the original building that it was conducted in is, of course, long gone. This is the south side. This is the Sol Seabury House at Tiverton Four Corners, again, directly north of Gray's parking lot, diagonally from the A.P. White store. I have a shot of the front of this house. Oh, this is the Duvall Wilcox house. This is a house that A.P. White lived in before he built the store. This is the west side of Sol Seabury House. It was built in the mid 1700s, and I forget which of the Sols built it, but then it became of Cornelius Sol inherited the house, and about 1810 he remodeled it, and this is a guy who wanted people to know that he lived in a Georgian. This is the original house would have looked nothing like this. He even has, this is actually a shingled house if you look at the close-up, but it has coins in the corner, which you never see on a wooden house, and the great symmetry of the dormers and everything. He made the very image of a Georgian. He died. Cornelius Sol sold it to Cornelius Seabury, who was his cousin, who had lived. He moved. Cornelius Seabury moved to this house from the Chase Corey house. And Cornelius Seabury, who was a sea captain himself, conducted a store for a time that was in the corner of the yard of this house. Cornelius Sol sold the house, and then a year later died in a shipwreck off the Philippines. So he would have been better off staying in Tiverton. This is Benjamin Franklin Seabury, another Greek revival. About 1850. He was a son of Cornelius Seabury. A lot of his family, that Seabury family, they became pretty prominent in New Bedford. One of them was the president of the Pearpoint Glass Company for a while, and other industries in New Bedford, whaling. Union Public Library, this land, the building dates from the 1880s, but the land for an earlier building was donated by Benjamin F. Seabury. If you could see a close-up of that sign, it says established in 1820, which is an extremely early date for any library in this area to be established. I think the New Bedford Public Library was established in like 1850s or something like that. So. This Chase Corey house, a shot of the west side. This is the Mill Race. This is south of Tiverton Four Corners got a better shot. Here's the mill. This was also run by A.P. White. It was built by a man named William Pitt Bateman in 1850, and this area of Tiverton was called Pittsville for a while, but someone in public relations, I guess, in Tiverton decided maybe we should change the name to Tiverton Four Corners. And it was purchased in 1865 by A.P. White and his brother, Charles White, who ran it under the name of Charles White and Brother. This mill continued in operation until after World War II.
What kind of mill was it?
Grist mill, regular grist mill, they ground corn, yep. This shows the two buildings from the south. This building on the south side, which is kind of a half-stone building, this was the original site of A.P. White's store. After he bought the mill, he first set up store here, and before he moved up to the Four Corners, which is just a short distance north, and used this as a storehouse later on. Oh, that building. This is the mill race for the mill. This is the mill pond, what's left of it behind there. The two brothers, Charles and A.P. White, had a falling out sometime, I guess, in the 1870s, and fought kind of for the rest of their lives. And Charles White, the mill is on this side. Charles White's house was on the other side of this pond. And in the late 1870s, one of the other big businesses, really, of this area came to be cutting ice. And so, A.P. White used to store the ice in that building that's to the south of the mill. But the two brothers, who were feuding all the time, there would be like a race to go out and cut the ice before the other brother could get to it. And this went on, I guess, for many years, and they were too stubborn to kind of sell out their business to one another. This house, Philip Quarry, is just south of between the Chase Quarry house to the north and the mill to the south. This is another Greek revival. This is the south side of the Chase Quarry house, showing the gambrel roof. It's the corn crib and the outhouse for Chase Quarry house. This is Colonel Pardon Gray Reserve in Tiverton, and Colonel Pardon Gray's wife was Mary Brown. She was a granddaughter of William White. The site of his house would have been about, that's Main Road in the distance. The site of his house was about in the middle of this field. This is the graveyard where Colonel Pardon Gray is buried. During the Revolution, he was served as the commissary for the army, which is a substantial army that was encamped in Tiverton, preparing for the Battle of Rhode Island. Lafayette made his headquarters at the Abraham Brown House, which is just a little bit north of here, which is still in existence. Now we're back to Westport. It's on Pine Hill Road, Stephen Wilcox's house. This house wasn't built by a White, but it was purchased by the brothers George and Roger White in the 1780s. Very unusual house. I don't know what was quite behind there, but
The story about that house is that the family had a dividing up, and they cut the house in half and moved one half away.
oh,
They built that other piece on it.
oh,
Right near there, and that was the story I always heard.
oh. Something did happen. This is such an odd house because on the east part, the roof is hipped on the east end and gabled on the west end, and the two halves don't really match up. I think there's another picture of it later on. They're kind of off-centered. This house is on the corner of further north on Pine Hill. This is the Corn Crib House. This was built by Lysander White, who was a great-great-grandson of William, out of a corn crib in 1880.
Where is this house?
That's on Pine Hill Road, or what you call New Pine Hill Road, just at the corner, just after you go around the corner heading north. Oh, well, this was built by John White, who was probably an ancestor of his. This house was built 1870 by John White, who was the father of Lysander. There was an old house built by John White's grandfather, Israel White, back in like the 1740s. They used to sit between these two houses where the barns are now. The father of John White was Gerathmiel White, had one of the great, two White brothers. One was Gerathmiel and the other was Theophilus. So some of them had a thing for names. This is back to the Wilcox house. And you can tell, I've always known something. I'm glad Kukey said something, because see how the two apps are not even like lined up. They just lined them up so they have a flush facade on this north side. But
Was that the same house we were looking at?
yes, just a minute ago, yes. This is on Drift Road. This is not shown for the houses, but for the site, if you will. This is part of the original James Tripp farm, which would have been owned by William White Jr. Purchased this in 1745, and this is where he lived. He would have lived in the James Tripp house, which I don't have a picture of, but it's a 1720 house that was rescued by Pete Baker and moved down to the river. This is the cemetery where Holder White Sr., we've seen Holder White Jr.'s house. Holder White Sr. is buried here. Holder White Sr. owned the Joseph Tripp farm, which is now Nokachoke Orchards. And this stone wall here that's on the north side of that cemetery is the dividing line between the old Joseph Tripp and James Tripp farms, which back in the day would have gone all the way from the river all the way over to Main Road. I think, although no one of the carved stones in this cemetery, this is a little bit removed from the Whites, but I'm sure that there's an awful lot of Tripp descendants in Westport. I think this is the burial place of both James and Joseph Tripp, who were really the ancestors of just about all the Tripps who were buried in Westport. It's odd because you have a gateway to the cemetery that leads north, which is to the Joseph Tripp farm, and a gateway to the south, which is the James Tripp farm, and I think this eastern end is probably where the earliest Tripps are buried in Westport. Some other, that's Reuben Wade or something. That would have been the site of James Tripp house. That's the Cummings house on Drift Road. Not sure what that is. Oh, this is the Little Compton. This is off West Main Road in Little Compton. This was part of the Peleg Bailey farm historically. Peleg Bailey's wife was a Gray, was a white descendant. These houses here were actually part of Fort Church in a World War II installation in Little Compton that was built to protect Newport. And people would cobble together the houses that the military kind of left behind. This is the view from the Peleg Bailey farm out over Awashonks Pond. Not the house that you just seen, but the old house that used to sit there was rented as a summer house back about 1900 by Henry Demarest Lloyd, who later, of course, his family lived in Little Compton for many years after that. This is right at the intersection of Warrens Point Road, Secana Point Road, and West Main Road in Little Compton. This is the Seconic Hotel. It was a hotel back in the day. I think I got some more, picture of it from the front here somewhere. I'll go back and look at this. This is the front. This was built as a hotel in the 1840s. Originally, it was much, much larger than this. It was about, on the front facade was 3 times this large, and it also had the old farmhouse, which was Isaac Bailey, grandfather of Isaac Bailey Richmond, who had the old farmhouse as an L extending to the rear. One of the Coe brothers bought this property from the Baileys in the 1840s, and he massively expanded everything and turned it into this great hotel. And just about that time, 1849 came around, and out he went to California, and down the tubes went the hotel. Isaac Bailey Richmond held a mortgage on it. He put it up for auction and ended up buying it, giving it to his son, Henry Isaac Richmond, who, of course, through his mother was a white descendant. And Henry Isaac Richmond tore down 2 wings of the hotel to make it a more manageable size, and converted it into a summer house. And put, again, I think some of the kind of double bracketing on the cornice, kind of Italian windows, very unusual. Side lights on the windows, not just on the doors. Very unusual design, and it's very similar to the house we saw at the Commons in some respect.
Excuse me, what is
Yes.
that feature going from the upper right-hand window? Looks like something that slants down to above that stove up there. Is that a board? Gutter? Oh, maybe it's a gutter.
It's a gutter.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's a gutter. I'll go back. I think I skipped over some pictures of the side of the. Oh, that's the view looking out on the Washox Pond. That pond was created by the 38 hurricane. It was just a swamp before. This is the south side of the house. This is actually where the old Isaac Bailey farm would have been situated. A view of the pond. This, the grounds of this, there was another, it was inherited by Henry Richmond Jr., who was kind of an eccentric guy in a lot of ways, but they actually, he set up some golf holes on his property, and this is before the Seconic Golf Club, which is based on another Old Bailey farm, was developed. People used to play golf here, which isn't a bad setting, but I would think the stone walls could make for some tough lies. That's the front of it. This is a bit south of that on Warrens Point Road. This is the east end of what was called for many years the White Farm. And this farm was owned by Oliver White, who was a son of William White. He doesn't seem to have lived here very much. Oliver White owned the property until the 1790s, but he lived in Newport and then in Hopkinton, and he seemed to have, it was eventually purchased by the Baileys. This picture is taken from the Philippi house. The Philippi's, this was developed, Dr. Truesdale, who owned beachfront property all over the place, he had the idea that he was going to turn this into a beach resort, this particular area here. And I forget the first name, well, the Philippi's, the oldest of the Philippi's, married one of his daughters, and they built various pavilions and such on the beach. And the problem was, on this side, it's really facing east, there wasn't much waves. It's a very pebbly and kind of uncomfortable beach. It never caught on as a beach resort. So in the spring of 1938, the Philippi's, they took all of the beach houses and such, and they kind of cobbled them together in kind of usual Little Compton fashion and built what they call Marsh House, which is still the Philippi house today. And you might say, well, that was pretty lucky to do that in the spring of 1938 before that. And it was lucky in one way and unlucky in another, because something else that the hurricane did, it took tons and tons of beautiful sand and put it all over that beach. So now they had a pristine, wonderful beach, but they had moved all the beach houses from it. And now we come to Westport Point. This is up the road, Edwin Lee Mayhew. His grandmother was a White, daughter of Christopher White. Edwin Lee Mayhew was he was a whaler, both out of Westport Point and out of New Bedford. In 1843, he shipped out aboard the Lagoda. And so you can see the ship model Lagoda, the world's largest ship model, at the Whaling Museum. This is, again, at Westport Point. This is the father of Edwin Lee Mayhew, Thomas White Mayhew. He was a wholesale fish dealer at Westport Point. And his mother was a White, Ruth White Mayhew. His father was Captain Hilliard Mayhew, who supposedly, I've read somewhere, I'm not sure if it's accurate or not, built Lee's Wharf, the original version of it anyway. And this is Isaac Corey's house. Isaac Corey married as his second wife and her second husband, the widow Ruth White Mayhew. Which leads us to Isaac Corey's store, which should be familiar. And I think I have one more house. This house, of course, I've mentioned, Peregrine White was the first white or English child born in New England. The first female white child was Elizabeth Alden Peabody. And this house off West Main Road in Little Compton is one of two houses in Little Compton that compete for the title of the Betty Alden House. This house was built by her son, William Peabody Jr. She probably did live in the house, Betty Alden. She lived a very long life, so probably about 1700 or so she was living in this house. The old 1690 part of the house is the part that's east or to the right of the doorway. And in the 1750s, this house was purchased by Colonel Pardon Gray, we've seen the site of his Tiverton house. And as I said, his wife was a granddaughter of William White. So I've always thought it's kind of neat because in this house, you have the first female born in New England, a house that later becomes occupied by a descendant of the first male born in New England. So it kind of brings things. That house is a long way in from the road. It's almost across from the Historical Society on the riverside of the road. And then we're back to the beginning. That's it.